If you really want to improve your confidence in assessment and diagnosis and immediately know where to start with treatment, I'm really excited to let you know that the Shoulder Sepsis Success course is now live and online for enrolments. We've got 12 modules which represent the approach I use every day in clinic. They're going to take you through that simple structured approach to assessment, how it looks in the clinic, how we can modify it in lots of different presentations, but importantly then look at how it informs your exercise selection and, of course, importantly, your progression. It's been really humbling to get feedback from people who've signed up for the course and the difference it's made to their practice in terms of their confidence, the patients they've been able to help, and also often they've become the go-to shoulder person within their team or within the place that they're working. Within the course, we've reviewed the evidence, we've looked at how to make it transferable to practice and really put together a practical, information-filled course that gives you that simple structured approach to assessment and treatment of patients with shoulder problems. And importantly, we update it regularly to make sure it remains representative of the literature. I'm a great believer in providing lots of resources that reflect people's different learning style to really help consolidate that content in lots of different ways. Now, if you're thinking about enrolling, we do some regular question and answer sessions. We do 4 of those every year. If you sign up to the lifetime access, you can get every single update that we do. And importantly, you also get access to a Facebook group. Now, that's something I love. It's a real opportunity to discuss cases. We can post interesting papers, share latest shoulder research, but it's also becoming a fantastic community of practice where we have clinicians who've worked through the course already and are happy to share their thoughts as well. So you don't only get my input. It's a really great community. But importantly, it gives you access to me so that I can answer your questions and make it specific to you. Now, if you want to know about the course content, then if you go to clinicaledge.co/shoulder success, you can find all about what's included and the huge amount of information, and importantly, the wealth of practical videos that show you immediately how to translate that into the clinic.